Hello, my name is Hui Hui, and I'm an Associate Director at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Thank you and welcome everyone, and to those that are watching online as well, welcome to this Atlantic Council event on the role of social and digital media in national and international discourse. This is part of the Cross-Strait series of the Scowcroft Center's Asia Security Initiative, which we proudly conduct through the generous support of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office, TECRO. This event will look at U.S.-China-Taiwan relations through the lens of digital and social media, with a particular focus on how these new forms of media have reshaped the trilateral relationship between these countries. Though President Trump may have been the individual most responsible for popularizing Twitter as a tool of statecraft, he is far from alone in his creative use of digital and social media. Other actors, both state and non-state, have also found these new forms of media to be fertile ground for a variety of political tactics, ranging from dissidence to disinformation. In the face of an overwhelming barrage of information, nation-states around the world have implemented widely varying regulations as they attempt to maintain national, regional, and economic security. Here at the Council, the Eurasia Center and Digital Forensics Lab have focused heavily on Russia's use of disinformation across the United States and Europe. Most recently, the Eurasia Center has launched a report called Democratic Defense Against Disinformation that asks what policy solutions can be used to strengthen the resilience of democracies in battles of influence and information. But for today, we have an esteemed panel of experts who will focus their discussion on the situation in East Asia. While President Trump's decision to sign the Taiwan Travel Act, incurring pointed rebukes from China, U.S.-China-Taiwan relations have grown even more strained, giving today's seminar a particular urgency. So as a reminder, this event is webcasted live and on the record. And please join the conversation on Twitter using #ACAsia and follow the Scowcroft Center at AC Scowcroft. Now let me quickly introduce our panel. We have Ms. Anne Henochowicz, who's commissioning editor at the China Channel Los Angeles Review of Books. Anne is a translator and digital journalist who writes about censorship and resistance discourse in China. Her work has appeared in China File, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and Foreign Policy. We have also Dr. Gary King here, who's on Skype with us. He is the Albert J. Weatherhead III University Professor at Harvard University and Director of the Institute for Quantitative Social Science. He develops and applies empirical methods in many areas of social science research, focusing on innovations that span the range from statistical theory to practical application. The third, we have Mr. Russell Hsiao, who is the Executive Director of the Global Taiwan Institute. He previously served as a Senior Research Fellow at the Project 2049 Institute and National Security Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Prior to these positions, he was editor of Chen the Brief at the Jamestown Foundation and a Special Associate in the International Cooperation Department at the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. And we also have our moderator, Mr. Joseph Bosco, who's currently a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Korean-American Studies and a regular panelist on Northeast Asia security issues. Mr. Bosco retired from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where his portfolios included strategic communications and Muslim outreach, East Asia security affairs, Iraq and Afghanistan coalition affairs, and disaster relief and humanitarian affairs. He used to be a former non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Asia Pacific Program and was a member of the Council's observer delegation to Taiwan for the historic 2000 presidential election, which saw Taiwan's first peaceful transfer of power. He served in the U.S. Navy as a communications officer on the 7th Fleet. So let me welcome our panel on stage now.
I'd also like to thank the Atlantic Council for sponsoring this program. A very timely topic, obviously, considering the daily news events. When Jiang Zemin visited President Clinton in 1997, they had a conversation about the rising internet. And Zhang told President Clinton that it needed to be managed, and in China they would find a way to control it. Bill Clinton laughed out loud and said, lots of luck. It's like nailing Jell-O to the wall. So we now have some folks here who I think can offer insights as to which of those two leaders got their predictions right, given the events of the last couple of decades. So I'll turn it over first to Anne and ask you to comment.
Hi, thanks, Hui and Mr. Bosco. So Jell-O has been nailed to the wall, at least in China. The prediction that was made probably sounded far-fetched in the 90s when the internet seemed like this completely open space, and the internet in China was for some time less controlled than it is now. I want to talk about, as an introduction, some of the major controls that are on the internet, both domestically in China, and how those controls and the theory around them are also being deployed abroad, as well as how some Silicon Valley tech companies and other international companies are conceding to those controls. So in China, in and of itself, there's been this concept of public opinion guidance for at least since the 2010. I think it's probably more like at least a decade, I would say. And the idea of that is to not tell people what to say or only have the state media, but to sort of guide the commentary that is visible online. So rather than having a completely top-down approach where censors that are employed by the government are manually deleting what people are posting that they deem is not part of the conversation they want to have continued. Instead, they delegate the blocks and deletion to these tech companies, which they've mainly been able to do because since 2009, all the platforms that we're used to using, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter primarily, have been blocked in China. Google pulled out of China in 2010. Instagram went down, I believe, when there were the protests in Hong Kong at the end of 2014. And so you have these domestic social media platforms that, in order to maintain operation in China, do have to comply with directives to either delete certain information or to filter that information from search results. And most recently you saw this, so when Xi Jinping was, in a landslide vote, was, now is able to stay at his post in perpetuity when the Constitution was amended just a few weeks ago. The censorship online was actually pretty strict. So the letter N, like the English letter N, was blocked on Weibo, which is sort of, people call it the Chinese equivalent of Twitter. And because people were talking about his, is it like the mathematical concept of N times? So it's like he'll have N terms. And there was also a clip that went very briefly viral before it was blocked. There was a group of journalists, and one particular journalist was asking this very long-winded question that didn't have a lot of substance. And so there was another journalist standing next to her who did this epic eye roll. And that video was huge for a few hours before it was blocked out. Now, in terms of how this affects international relations, China has this concept that has been pushing abroad of internet sovereignty. So, just as you respect China's laws when you're in the PRC, you also respect our cyber laws when you're using the internet in our country. And this has been promulgated through this now annual World Internet Conference held in Wuzhen, which is in southern China. And most significantly, the 2016 cybersecurity law has now taken effect, and international tech companies operating in China have to comply with a whole raft of laws by the end of this year in order to remain operable in China. One of those laws, or one of the stipulations of that law, in Article 23, I believe, no, Article 37, is that data from Chinese users has to be stored in data centers in China. And so at the end of February, if you were an Apple iCloud user in China, your data is no longer stored on iCloud servers in the US or in other parts of the world. It's stored in these centers that are with, there's a partnership with Apple and a local third-party data server that is connected to the government in the province where it's located in Guizhou. And in fact, just a few days after everyone's data was migrated, there was someone writing on Weibo about how his data had been hacked. And so the issue with the idea of internet sovereignty is both that with things like this World Internet Conference, it's getting pushed to other countries, and at the same time, these international companies that, for instance, when they operate in the US, we expect to respect our privacy, not have complete access to our contacts, our email. Now it's playing by China's rules in order to comply with this new law. So I have much more that I could say, but I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Okay. Dr. King, if you can hear us, we'd love to get your input at this point. Yes.
Yeah.
So social media is this tremendous democratizing force, right? Because all of a sudden, one person will be able to write something and potentially everybody in the country can see it. Isn't that right? And then, without telling you my answer, later in the afternoon, another reporter just as excitedly called me and said, so social media is a brand new way for the government to crack down on people and slow the flow of information. Isn't that right? And the interesting thing is both reporters were absolutely right. So it's the way we have to look at this, I think, is that both are happening at the same time. It's not only that the government is cracking down, it's not only that there are new tools for people to express themselves, it's that there is a competition between the people and the government. And what we see is the equilibrium between those two. So in our research, what we noticed was the Chinese propaganda department is an enormous effort designed to slow the flow of information. But it's so large that it conveys a lot about the intentions and the plans and the goals of the Chinese leaders. It's like a big elephant tiptoeing around. It leaves big footprints. And if you look at that at scale, if you see what's going on at scale, you can actually see quite a lot. So we figured out how to download all Chinese language social media posts before the Chinese government could decide which ones should be censored. That works for being able to reverse engineer what they were after. We also recently figured out the Chinese 50-cent party, where they were rumored to have made up social media posts, fabricated them, and posted them in the name of other people. I'll tell you briefly what we found is, but in order to find what we found, the key thing is that you need to look at things at scale. So it's not that, there's a continuum from fully human to fully automated, and analysis has to include all of these. So fully human is no longer feasible to study the 750 million social media posts that appear on the web every day. It's just not feasible. None of us are up to this, no matter how many research assistants one has. We say at Harvard, there's only so much pizza you can give undergraduates. So you can't do it completely human, but on the other hand, you can't do it fully automated either. An example of something that's fully automated is a driverless car where you don't tell it where to go. Or a fully quantitative analysis is an Excel spreadsheet with column or row labels. It's completely dumb. But if you have human-led computer-assisted technology, you can really do things that you couldn't otherwise. So just to give you a few examples, we discovered that the Chinese the Chinese censorship was not after what we all thought it was. We all thought it was for that they were censoring criticism of the government, the leaders, and their policies. But it's absolutely not true. You can say the nastiest things about the leaders. You can say they're all stealing money. Here's where it is. They all have mistresses. This is their names. That will not be censored. But if you say, and let's go protest, they'll censor you. In fact, if you say the leaders of this other town are doing such a great job, let's have a big rally in their favor, that will also be censored. They don't care what you think about them. They only care what you do, what you can do. And if you have the ability to move crowds, then that's what they're concerned about, because they're not so concerned about Western military powers. They are, however, concerned about their own people. Similarly, for fabricated social media posts, what everybody thought is that these fabricated posts were basically arguing against anybody who would say something negative about the government. But that turns out not to be true at all. What these 400, we discovered there were 450 million social media posts that the Chinese government makes up by hand. They have people writing them, 450 million of them. And what they do is they're not arguing with people who argue against the government. In fact, they're not arguing at all. What they're doing is cheerleading. They're saying, hey, let's notice that it's a beautiful day today. Or I noticed this morning, I got up this morning thinking of how important our martyrs were to the history of China. It's basically drivel cheerleading kinds of stuff. And you'd say, why in the world does the Chinese government write 450 million social media posts that sort of don't say anything? And the answer is that they don't do this all the time. They fire them in giant bursts only when they need it. So if there's a big protest or something like that, they fill the internet with distractive cheerleading. And if you think about it, think about the last time you had an all-out fight with your parents or spouse or kids, and you wanted to end the argument. So option one is you're all good intellectuals and academics. So option one is you give your spouse or kids the best intellectual argument for why they're wrong. How often did that work? Option two is you say, hey, let's go get ice cream, right? And effectively, that's what the Chinese government is doing. I would think that it's probably really effective. So we have built industrial strength versions of this. This giant propaganda department that conveys unintentionally a lot about itself also conveys a tremendous amount of valuable information around. So we can predict and have predicted ahead of time that they're about to pick up a dissident, or that they're about to sign a peace treaty, or other kinds of stuff. So we've learned a lot from the Chinese government, and while they're trying to slow down the flow of information.
Thank you, Dr. King. Russell Hsiao, would you like to jump in here?
Sure. Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for the invitation to participate in today's seminar. It's a very timely seminar, as Joe mentioned, and it's great to be back at Atlantic Council. Just to inject a light note to the conversation, the last time I was back here was in December 2nd, 2016. For those of you who are familiar with U.S.-Taiwan relations, that is quite a historic day. That was also the day when President-elect Trump took a congratulatory phone call from President Tsai Ing-wen. So I'm eagerly anticipating what might happen after today's meeting. So that was just humor. So, but allow me to preface my comments also by making 4 general points. I applaud the organizer for today's conference in leading off with the 2 earlier presentations, because they focused on the technology. And what I'll focus on in my presentation is more on providing a context in terms of cross-strait relations, and also in terms of Chinese strategy. And so the 4 points I would like to make is, the first, the use of propaganda and disinformation is not unique to China. The Soviet Union was engaged in similar, not the same, activities during the Cold War. While the Soviets employed a far more nefarious technique called active measures, it involved a similar range of manipulative techniques for influence operations by overt and covert propaganda, the use of front organizations, agents of influence, and deception. Now, while the scale and scope of these activities differed, the general objective were similar in the sense that they're both intended to create a psychological effect that would help advance their interests and to discredit the enemy. The second point, the use of propaganda and disinformation is not a new phenomenon in the Chinese context. There is a rich history of it in Chinese strategic thinking. It may be somewhat cliche to refer to Sun Tzu's Art of War, but the ancient Chinese strategist does cover at length the importance of deception and confusing the mind of the enemy commander. Sun Tzu discusses means to rob the enemy of his spirit, to cause fear, consternation, and confusion, all of which are objectives of propaganda and disinformation. The third point is that the Chinese Communist Party has always placed a premium on the control of media as a critical tool for political control and mobilization. Before the advent of mass media, this was much harder to do, and this is why the CCP built up and maintains today what Dr. King had mentioned, a sprawling CCP organization department. As a party tool, it was used to unify thought in controlled area, but also promote loyalty to the party. In uncontrolled area, it was used to propagate its ideas and persuade the masses to align with the party. After 1949, the creation of the People's Republic of China, state-controlled mass media in the form of print newspaper, radio, television, broadcasting thereafter, soon after, have been critical mediums for political control in the CCP-led authoritarian system. A monopoly on information through party-state-sanctioned mass media allowed the party to propagate its narrative while limiting space for opposing views. Given the sensitivity of history, information control, and censorship have been essential tools for party-state to control society through perception management, propaganda, and disinformation. The fourth and final point, which also leads me to my topic today, is that given the history of the Chinese Civil War and the importance of Taiwan's unification for Chinese leaders, the use of propaganda and disinformation have been long used as tools for CCP political objectives against Taiwan. Now, as I mentioned earlier, propaganda and disinformation have been tools used in both political and military campaigns. During the Chinese Civil War, the nationalist and the communist armies would spread false information to sow discord in enemy-controlled area, spreading rumors about defections, false enemy attack plans, for the very purpose of stirring up unrest and misdirect enemy planning. After the nationalist government was established on Taiwan in 1949, the propaganda and disinformation war continued as the two sides flooded propaganda into other enemy-controlled territories to affect public opinion and troop morale. Starting as early as the 1950s and lasting until the 1990s, the two sides were engaged in an intensive psychological war in the Taiwan Strait that included the prolific use of propaganda and disinformation. It's debatable, but I do think that the PRC had an upper hand here. Even though Taiwan had better technology, also the assistance of the United States, China's ability to saturate the geography of Taiwan is much stronger than Taiwan's ability to do the same in China. Following the second Taiwan Strait crisis in 1958, the two governments, as I mentioned, were intensively engaging in propaganda warfare aimed at turning military personnel against their own regimes and encouraging them to defect. Ground zero of this war, without gunfire, was between Taiwan-controlled Jingmen and PRC-controlled Xiamen. Before the internet, both sides were using megaphones, radio stations, and broadcasting, and utilized balloons as well as floating carriers for sending leaflets and other objects that advertise defections of the enemy troops, promising rewards for people who had defected, and also other messages to have a psychological effect on the targeted population. Now, with the lifting of restrictions on cross-strait interactions, travels, trade, it became easier for the two sides to influence one another through propaganda and disinformation. The lifting of martial law and associated measures in Taiwan had a transformative impact on Taiwanese society. To put this in the sort of media perspective, and this is what we are talking about, in 1988, when Taiwan lifted restrictions on news outlet, the number of media outlets exploded from only 29 to about 883 outlets. But coverage of cross-strait issues were strictly regulated by both sides. Even more so is the formulation of policy, which were kept top secret and only the domain of the ruling elites in Taiwan and in China. Naturally, with Taiwan's democratization, more people within Taiwan demanded to have a say in public affairs, and in particular on the importance of a relationship with a neighbor that is fast becoming Taiwan's at that time, largest trading partner, but also a growing menace that is threatening the use of military force if it did not succumb to its will. Now, it's no secret that Beijing's ultimate objective is to subjugate Taiwan under the People's Republic of China, under its one country, two systems formula. This was clearly spelled out by General Secretary and perhaps the President for Life, Xi Jinping's report at his 19th Party Congress. And as a means to effect this outcome, Beijing has utilized an all-of-society approach through its United Front, which is a strategy to control, indoctrinate, and mobilize non-CCP masses to support the CCP's political objectives of first, undermining nationalist rule over Taiwan, and then now undermining Taiwan's democracy and its flourishing democratic government. Now, the information and communication technology revolution certainly opened up new channels for disinformation and propaganda through the internet. In this new media environment, where there are growing an abundance of information and sources, the quality and reliability of information have been called increasingly into question. I mean, Taiwan enjoyed an advantage, perhaps at the beginning of this information warfare due to its access to higher capital and education. That advantage is also eroding as Beijing exploits the openness and transparency of democratic systems to propagate and disinform the people of Taiwan. Just as politicians in Taiwan realized that they could utilize the value of the internet and social media and digital media in campaigning, messaging, and mobilizing, I believe that PRC also realized that it needs to control information flow on the internet within its territories that it controls, but it can also use that to affect and influence discussions that occur on the digital sphere. Without going into too many details about Taiwan's sort of new media landscape, because I would like for us to get into the discussion on this, I would just briefly point out several different ways in which China now is trying to utilize new media for disinformation and propaganda. The first is by spreading or planting false information on Chinese websites that then gets carried by Taiwanese news agencies as well as social media in Taiwan, and then circulated and has a viral effect on Taiwan social media, creating a sort of a semblance of truth, if you will. Even if the Taiwan government denies the validity of the truth of the article, and there were cases, for instance, of a H-6K bomber picture that had the picture of Yushan, which is one of the tallest mountains in Taiwan, that circulated in social media. The Taiwan government had to come out and deny that this was a picture of this, but the impact of that has already been felt when it went viral and it was circulated widely. This obviously can cause concern among the populace about the safety of Taiwan and the ability, perhaps, of even the defense establishment to be able to protect Taiwan. The second means is using traditional Chinese media, deliberately misquoting officials and ex-official statements. This is actually quite a common technique that's used by a lot of media outlets in China to utilize opportunities where there are ex-officials making comments about cross-strait relations and taking them out of context, but then making them go viral either through social media, and in which case then these ex-officials have to come out and say either deny these events, or deny the quotes, or have to clarify their statements. By then again, the effects of which have already been felt when it has already been spread to thousands, if not even more so, viewers. I think the third is perhaps much more worrisome to me, is the infiltration of civil society through United Front activities that can plant disinformation and propaganda. Taiwan is a thriving democracy with a vibrant civil society, and the rise of civil society in Taiwan played in no small part a pivotal role in the bottom-up democratization process in Taiwan, where there was only state-sanctioned media. Civil society provided alternative voices, alternative narratives to the voices on Taiwan. But as Taiwan is becoming more democratic, groups are also are proliferating that are utilizing this freedom, registering as groups in Taiwan civil society groups in Taiwan, and then stirring up challenges to the central rule. This degrades the credibility information from these groups. The fourth of which Dr. King had already mentioned, which is about computational propaganda. And so I won't go into too much depth about that. I'll just maybe end there, Joe, and then perhaps we can get into discussions. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you, Russell. Thank all of you for your comments. What we'll do is I'll pose a question to each of you, and we'll see how much time we have for audience participation. And the last time I was in China, my young guide would take me around, and only when we were in private circumstances would he talk about the government. And he said that his generation, he was probably early 30s, have found ways to get around the Great Firewall, that they know how to play the system and can communicate information. But what I'm not clear on is, do they see that system, or do you see the social media and digital media as a way of supplanting the mass media, or is it do they simply use the social media as a way of extracting from the mass media the kinds of messages they want to communicate with each other? So is it a conduit and a filter for the mass media, or is it something that replaces it and they simply ignore what they hear in the mass media and rely on their own sources and interactions?
So the digital ground in China has been shifting so much that if we were having this conversation 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said that people are in fact using social media as an alternative source, and in fact a more trusted source. But that has been sharply curtailed through a combination of legislation and crackdowns on rumors and internet celebrities, as well as the rise of different social media platforms. So to give a very brief history of this, there was the rise of Weibo, this Twitter-like platform where you can post 140 characters or less. And it was, I think, started in 2009, but really gained momentum in 2010, 2011. And then in the summer of 2011, there was this horrific train crash on the brand new high-speed rail in Wenzhou. And the rescue crew there were actually told less than 24 hours after this crash had happened to bury train cars, even though they hadn't even searched to make sure that no one was left in them. Yeah. And people from state media, as usual, were told, wait for instructions, don't report on this yet, and then when you do report, here's what you're going to say. Well, since the journalists weren't able to say what they were really seeing, they through their employer, they would just post on their personal Weibo accounts. In addition, you had passengers posting in real time when this crash was happening and in the aftermath. And it looked as if this golden age of citizen journalism had just blossomed in China. Within days, I think you had 7 million more posts on Weibo about what had happened, and the government had to respond to the public rather than the other way around. And in fact, the former Minister of Railways was jailed, eventually imprisoned because of this, and the Ministry of Railways dissolved, and all of that probably wouldn't have happened without the power of Weibo. But then it changed so quickly. So in 2013, when she had been in power for about a year, you had this simultaneous crackdown on Weibo celebrities. So people like, there's a Beijing real estate magnate, Pan Xi, who would not just talk about business, but he'd actually talk about, for instance, the air pollution problems in Beijing and other social issues. So you had these kinds of celebrities who were being publicly chastised on national TV. And then at the same time, you also had a reinterpretation of laws against rumors, so that if a post that someone puts up that contains false information were either read 5,000 times or reposted 500 times, that person could face up to 3 years in prison, which is especially scary because you can't control how many people are reading or sharing a post that you put online. And as Weibo was going down in this way, at the same time, a rival platform, WeChat or Weixin, was on the rise. And people now, if you go to China, like, people don't even ask for your phone number, they ask what's your Weixin. And so the problem there is that WeChat is more like it's more like Facebook in that the conversation isn't public to anyone on the site. You have to be following someone in order to see what they're writing, and so it is much easier to control the narrative in that scenario. So to go back to your question, people were at a certain moment harnessing social media to get around what they weren't able to say in mass media, but there have been a number of controls that have made it such that if you go on Weibo now, it's going to be like boy bands and Xinhua and People's Daily, pretty much.
So they have succeeded in nailing the Jello to the wall for at least this phase of.
May I add one more thing about that? So sometimes they let the Jello go free. And this actually has to do with China-Taiwan relations. When the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, was first elected in January of 2016, you had this battalion of little pinks, mostly high school and college women, who had met on this online forum on Baidu Tieba, it's Postbar. And they were teaching each other how to get over the Great Firewall, the firewall that blocks a lot of internationally available websites from Chinese users. They were telling each other how to use a VPN, how to get over that, so that they could troll Tsai Ing-wen on her Facebook page. And they just flooded her page with everything from photos of Chinese cuisine and how beautiful Chinese cities are to things that I can't repeat on this stage. And so the rules are bent when it's in some sort, at least appears to be in some sort of national interest.
Thank you. Dr. King, do you want to comment at all on that aspect of?
Yes, I think so. Actually, there's still lots of political content on Weibo. We can see it when we're monitoring what's going on, and so I can give you examples. I just looked, recently on February 10th. There was the Communist Youth League expressed outrage about the Korean broadcasting system because the news service reportedly announced that the Taiwan team was originating from Taiwan, the capital from Taiwan, and the capital of Taiwan is Taipei, rather than the official CCC sanctioned name, which was Chinese Taipei, and it was shared thousands of times, and it was censored. So that sort of seems obvious, right? Because they wouldn't want this information. But why was it censored? It was censored because that kind of discussion did actually create collective action on the ground, not because they disagreed with it. They don't censor things that they disagree with. They censor things that might actually pose a risk to them leading the country. So I can give you lots of examples like this. But let me give one more point, which is related to your original question, which was the relationship between the mass media and social media. The Chinese government, of course, treats the two very differently, and as you mentioned, it is possible that individual social media posts can have a very big influence, and we just heard a great example of that. But it is the case, however, that the mass media has a much bigger effect normally on social media, and so it makes sense that they have a tighter control over that. Really knowing what the effect is in China is sort of difficult because we can't run experiments there all the time. But we actually ran an experiment in the US. And in the US, we convinced 48 media outlets to let us experiment on them. and we told them what to publish and when to publish at randomly assigned dates and times under a very specific protocol that they agreed with. And we showed actually that small media outlets, really small ones, about the size of like the Progressive or Ms. Magazine, have a quite enormous effect on the national conversation about large issues. So this is probably true in China as well, which may account for why they crack down on specific on the large media outlets with much more precision than they do in social media. So lots of things happen in social media, and they're not as tight about it. So lots of things.
Joe, if I may just,
Sure.
Before you move on to your next question, I did want to put this in, again, I think the two speakers did a really good job in putting the Taiwan context in there, but there's another case that I think really highlights the degree of tightening control of the PRC's tightening control over social media. And this is the case of Li Mingzhe, who is a human rights activist who was detained a year before because he had, according to court documents, had been using social media, Chinese social media, to allegedly subvert Chinese communist rule, and so was then therefore found, forced to confess to these charges that put forward. And I think this is an example by which Chinese control of social media within its territories is going to have has actually effects outside of territories that it controls. And I think it's important to point that out because I think, for many Taiwanese people who do travel to China, they will see this as an example by which the Chinese government is monitoring their social media. They should need to be quiet unless they want to be, they should refrain from expressing their political views, perhaps even when they are in Taiwan, if they should ever be found to, their social media accounts to be found to be, subverting whatever that means, CCP rule. So I think this is just an example.
Yeah. I wanted to come back to something that Dr. King said both in his presentation and in his response just now, and that was the selective use of censorship by the Chinese authorities, that you indicated that there are times they won't censor, they're very happy to let 100 flowers bloom. But if we remember that original experience with the 100 flowers, when people did speak out freely, Mao Zedong took action against them later. So I wonder how much, aside from censorship, how much does the Chinese government use the information it collects to persecute individuals who, even if they don't result in a mass protest, are considered dangerous to the state or to the party?
Give you an example of exactly what you're talking about. Well, I mean, actually, let me first put aside, obviously they go after individuals, they arrest them, they do all kinds of stuff. And so we're talking about a much bigger scale. But one thing that they do on a larger scale that they use criticism for is to judge their local leaders, right? So if you think about it, if you're running China, what do you want? What's your goals? Well, you're basically more powerful than, the President of the United States and Bill Gates combined, right? So you have a good thing going. But what is it that you want? Well, you want to keep a good thing going. So how do you do that? So operationally, there's something like 700 towns and cities across China, 700,000 governments. So you appoint 700,000 of your closest friends to run them. How does that work exactly, right? How do you know that one of them is not going to be stealing too much money, is a little too corrupt, and annoys the citizens of that town too much, that causes them to rise up in protest, and that protest then might spread contagiously across the country, and you might lose your job? How do you monitor all of those local officials? And it turns out they use criticism on social media. So when there's criticism of a local town, they're much more likely to take out that leader. So as we monitor on large scales, we can see things like that. So they clearly do that. They monitor the success of their local leaders based upon how much criticism they get. And then, of course, they stop collective action as a sort of hair on fire event.
That's quite fascinating. I hadn't considered that aspect. So Xi Jinping's crackdown on corruption, Bo Xilai was, I guess, the first dominant figure that got wrapped up in it, may well have been facilitated by the kinds of protests they're hearing through social media, complaints about individual leaders at the local level or the regional or provincial level. That's
a lot. I mean, he's been clearly taking out lots of the local leaders, and some of the information that he's probably using is what people are saying on social media. And back to the original, to the main point that you raised originally, which is, well, what's the relationship between the people and the government? Well, so they're cracking down on collective action and protest. So suppose you're in one of these towns and you want some more government services, and you know that the government doesn't want protest. So what do? Well, if it's important enough to you, you protest. You get some of your friends together and you line up outside the government building. And so so now, of course, if you go too far, they'll cut your head off. But you don't, the leaders of the town don't really want to do that either, because that would create even more protest. So it's clearly a cat and mouse competitive dueling banjos arms race, just to mix four metaphors at the same time.
May I just
Please.
build on what Dr. King said? I think Xi Jinping has not just kept a good thing going, but made a good thing for himself even better through this anti-corruption campaign and through channeling people's anger at local officials. And while the technology is new, there's something actually quite almost just like historical or ahistorical about that. At least in imperial China, there was this sense of going to the top, having an audience, even with, all the way up to the emperor, if things were not going right on the local level. And so I think, people can complain this way about, they can vent and complain about the local government, and then Xi and the Central Party make themselves look great because they are rooting out that corruption. Yeah. And also as to how that information is harnessed, I should clarify that there is a big difference between deleting something and blocking something. So, for instance, at China Digital Times, where I was the translations editor, we have a list of words that have been blocked at one point or another from Weibo search results since April of 2011. And those terms are usually blocked at certain times, probably when people want to take collective action on a certain thing, or the government decides that they're talking too much about something and it might lead to a collective action. And there's some of this is very topical. So, for instance, when the former securities czar Zhou Yongkang was detained and then undergoing trial, when he was first detained, there were lots of people talking about it on Weibo, and it wasn't necessarily that there were people going in and deleting all those posts, because at least at the time that was something that really needed humans to do, and they do have humans doing that, but instead they would block just his name. Or different spellings of his name, and people started calling him Master Kong instead of Zhou Yongkang, because there's a brand of instant noodles called Kang Sufu Master Kong, and so people were posting those images, and it's also a cat and mouse. It took the censors time to catch up with that metaphor, but those posts that contain those blocked keywords, they actually are still there, so the poster can still see them on their Weibo page. But if I search that particular term at that particular time, it's going to look like people aren't talking about it. And as I mentioned before, these are shifting sands. So there was a period a few years ago, I think it was like October of 2015-ish, when it seemed like words that were absolutely taboo were pulling up search results on Weibo. Things like 6/4, which refers to June 4th, 1989. But all of the posts that came up with those results were like, my grandma's birthday is on June 4th, things that were completely innocuous.
Oh, that's fascinating. I have a question on the dog that didn't bark. When I was at DOD, every year we would have a compilation of the number of mass protests that occurred throughout China. And, you know, it would escalate year by year, 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 individual protests in various parts of the country. And the concern that Beijing had, of course, was that somehow people in Beijing would learn about a protest in Shanghai on the very same issue that they were concerned about, and they would link up and form some kind of a coalition or a network of protesters. And when you magnify that by the number of cities in China and the number of protests that have occurred, I was always amazed that there wasn't that coalescence of the protests on a large-scale basis. And you kind of referred to that, Dr. King, and I wonder how has China managed to keep all these potential enemies of the state and of the party separate, so that they never were able to have a mass movement, a national mass movement. And to flip the coin, when the umbrella movement in Hong Kong occurred and the sunflower protests in Taiwan, there was a lot of communication between those two sets of people, and they kind of encouraged, gave at least moral support. So can someone elaborate on how it worked in Taiwan and Hong Kong but didn't work in the rest of China?
I'd love to comment on both of the previous speakers. So you know, that's really interesting. And first of all, I'd love to get the data from the DoD on the number of protests. It's extremely difficult to get reliable data on protests. We actually traced the only actual source of real protests in China to a newspaper article that reported that this guy had done a study, a sociologist, who turned out to be Xi Jinping's PhD advisor. And, needless to say, he didn't exactly respond to our inquiries for a copy of his paper. But if you look at what China's doing through the lens that you just provided, what it's doing is clipping social ties so that protest doesn't spread from town to town. Even the one-child policy, which might not have been developed for that purpose, makes it so you have fewer social ties. Even the assumption or the cultural situation there where it's easier to do business with somebody you know there than somebody you don't know, which clearly hurts the economy in a huge way. Almost the definition of an economy is something where you can do business with people you don't know. Keeping that going is actually very helpful. Stopping collective action in its tracks, not reporting in social media on collective action, censoring it anytime they can, firing giant bursts of dilutive cheerleading in the middle of these protests, stopping the protesters in Hong Kong by stealing an app they had to avoid going through the cell phone towers, and making another copy of it and making it work exactly the same way as the original one that would avoid the cell phone towers, only it would send information back home, right? And basically everything they're doing is to try to avoid the contagion. So that's a really insightful comment, I think. Susan's point about the words that they use, that's a really important point. We worked very hard on this because as we were trying to follow the thread of the conversation, the Chinese social media sites would do something like they would censor the word freedom, okay? And then the Chinese people would swap out the word freedom and they would swap in two words, I and field. And if you speak Chinese and you think of what those characters look like, they look sort of like the word for freedom, right? And so then people would say, we really need more I fields in China. And of course, if you're Chinese, you can read that and you know exactly what it means. But the automated text analysis, the primitive automated text analysis technology that for whatever reason the Chinese websites use can't just detect they let one through and they don't let the other one through. And the Chinese people, of course, if I gave you a sentence and said you couldn't use the following words 1, 2, and 7, could you rewrite it? Of course. And so we actually had to come up with, and did come up with, a new technology to be able to surface these words, which we could, you could make up words yourself, but it would be very difficult to guess what words somebody else is making up to convey the same information. So we came up with technology to do that. It works extremely well. I'm not looking for a contract with the Chinese government, thank you very much. But it helps us follow the thread of the conversation when people are diverting and trying to evade the censors.
Thank
Joe,
you.
I'd just like to
Go ahead, Russell.
Just
Sure.
one point, Joe, and that is, unlike in China, this is a very obvious point. There is no great firewall on Taiwan, and that is why the people of Taiwan, the youth in Taiwan, are able to organize and assemble and to protest their government through the Sunflower Movement, and and their relationship with the people in Hong Kong struggling to have greater democracy in Hong Kong is a natural extension of that sort of collective mentality of being able to aspiration for democracy. I'm concerned by what is apparent in the PRC's exertion of greater control over Hong Kong,
Right.
and limiting not only the technological aspect of limiting Hong Kong people's ability to communicate outwards, but there are already indications that there are preventing people from even traveling abroad in order to participate in what should be permitted activities. And so I think that there's some troubling signs here that what had been previously a more open environment that was completely civil society focused is now being limited by the Chinese government.
Yeah. Well, I guess they even restricted movement of Hong Kongers to Taiwan during the election, the 2016 elections. They cut back on that. Did you have anything in before we go to the audience?
No.
Okay, we're happy to open it up. Please raise your hand, wait for a microphone, identify yourself and any affiliation you have, and direct your question to a particular panelist if you wish.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kathy Tai. I'm from SIPE. I have a question regarding the mass protest. So Dr. King mentioned that the censorship machine will delete and take out some of the keywords, so then to avoid the potential for mass protest. So my question is with the AI technology in terms of voice recognition technology and also facial recognition technology, so being so sophisticated in China nowadays, they can identify a foreign reporter within like less than 7 minutes, and then I kind of suspect that will become just a more faster and faster. So with the advancement on AI technology, do they still need to continue to control, take out some of keywords online, just so then they can prevent mass protests on the street? And the second question is to Russell. So you mentioned that there's a information warfare between mainland China and Taiwan, and then you also mentioned some of the key threats that Taiwan is facing. So if it's a warfare, then how does Taiwan fight back or deal with these challenges? Thank you.
I'll take the first one. It's a great question. The Chinese government does not have these systems that you're describing or you can imagine in place now, but it seems like a perfectly obvious prediction that they will. It's a big job, even if you know how to do it, to roll it out to a country of that size, because it's not unified. Most censorship happens inside individual companies. And although the government is sort of directing it, they are directing the overall direction. They're not directing it with precision, and the individual sites have to do it. So developing the technology, rolling it out to the country, that's going to take it's possible to do a lot of this stuff. In American social media sites, in real time, just to give you an analogy, they can detect nudity in real time in a video and take down the video just as it's happening. So now the Chinese government, I guess, is also interested in pornography, but that means they could also find many other things, even in video. So yes, there's much more coming. You would.
Kathy, that's an excellent question. And I did not want to leave the seminar without raising some of the efforts that Taiwan is undertaking You're right in pointing out that I do sense a very grave challenge because of the geographic size of Taiwan versus that of China, and so the ability of China to saturate the information environment over Taiwan is strong. But I do think that there are some efforts underway that should be noted. Two in particular stands out. One is a campaign to increase media literacy within Taiwan. I think it's worth pointing out that Taiwan's digital minister, Audrey Tang, had recently indicated that there's a plan to address the problem of fake news in Taiwan through public education. And so there is an effort to introduce media literacy as a curriculum in Taiwanese schools. And so I think that's a good effort to sort of raise awareness within Taiwan about how to spot fake domains, how to be critical of news sources. That really is going to provide a long-term, I think, solution to the problem that we face. More immediate, through a technological effort, there is an interesting initiative that is one of the most prevalent use of social media or communication app that's used in Taiwan is Line, right? And Line is there's increasingly more problems with fake news being spread through Line. And so there has to be a need to address the ability of fake news sources. And so a team of developers created a what is a bot called 真的假的, right? And it's like, are you like, it's kind of loosely translated, are you serious? Is this for real? When people online, if they are signed up online, can then send these fake links or suspicious links that they find online to this bot. And then the bot will be, which is managed by a team of editors, are able to then filter through to see whether or not this is a credible news source, and then provide a feedback to the Line user about whether or not this is about the credibility of the news source. And I think that's a more immediate. It's not a comprehensive sort of way to sort of really address this issue. I think what a more comprehensive way that really needs to be, that I think extends beyond what Taiwan can do itself, is that there needs to be greater efforts between democracies to work together and to really, really be able to protect against, propaganda and disinformation. And I want to emphasize that this initiative should not be about to effect change in non-democratic countries. This is about protecting democratic institutions within democracies. And I think that's really, and I think there are channels by which the United States and Taiwan could be working closer together to, raise awareness about the different tactics, techniques, procedures used by these organizations to spread propaganda and disinformation. And I think the Atlantic Council organized a conference about Europe from looking at Russia's disinformation campaign, and I think there are similar efforts that can be looked at in the Taiwan context. Mm-hmm.
Great. Any other questions? You saturated with all this information about information?
Thank you. Neil Hare with Global Vision Communications. I guess to you, Russell, just to continue on that thought, has anybody or you looked at the content in Taiwanese social media in terms of what Taiwanese people want for Taiwan or their future or independence or vis-a-vis China, since it is more freer? Do we know what we're seeing and hearing? And maybe you, Professor, if you know this answer as well, but be very interested to know if there's anything like that out there.
I'm not aware of any sort of scientific study done on social media in Taiwan assessing attitude towards those specific issues that you talked about. But Taiwan is a very, there are a lot of public opinion polls conducted in Taiwan by traditional research institutions, as well as mass media, traditional mass medias. And so there are abundant public opinion polls done about the people's attitude towards these political issues, and so I think it will be interesting to sort of see differences in terms of how people respond to social media inquiries versus these traditional inquiries. Perhaps there might be some generational differences because of just the level of maybe younger generations that would use social media versus older generation. But I think that given the variety and the diversity of public opinion polls that are being conducted already in Taiwan, I think we do have a pretty good sense already in terms of people's attitudes towards issues related to identity, independence versus unification, to other sort of social issues on Taiwan. I mean, that's sort of.
And social media as well, just American social media companies and others gets to Taiwan. So I think this is a good question that although I agree there's no academic studies that I know of, we could do that. We could also study it in addition to the public opinion polls. We could study it in social media.
Lady?
Hi, Shelley Himes with Angel Enterprises. Just to continue on his point, what are your opinions, or what do you hear with regard to the more traditional media opinion polls, vis-a-vis Taiwan and China?
Yes. Well, I think I'm generalizing at this point, but there is a growing sense of Taiwanese identity within Taiwan, a sense of identification that is separate from the People's Republic of China. There is with relationship with China, there is a overwhelming majority that prefers the status quo, maintaining the status quo. How it's defined, of course, is it's a matter of sort of scholarly as well as political debate. But the maintenance of the current situation is the overwhelming preference of the people of Taiwan. I think that there are, growing concerns about the pressure campaign that the PRC is engaged in, both diplomatically, economically, and militarily. So it's going to be interesting to see how that's going to play out. This is an election year in Taiwan. In November, there are going to be many local elections. Back in 2014, that ushered in what is now the ruling party. So the local election sort of was a bellwether in terms of the 2016 presidential elections. So we'll see what happens in end of this year and what it may mean for 2018. So the president is currently has been suffering from a sort of a lower approval rating. That I think largely relates to a lot of the domestic challenges that she's faced in trying to reform the pension system in Taiwan, and so it's. But nevertheless, I think there has been again maintaining overwhelming support for maintaining the status quo in cross-strait relations.
Are there other questions? If not, I have one for yes, please.
Hi, and my question is, because of the different social media policies and practices in China and in the markets that Chinese companies may want to enter, will this tension impede Chinese tech companies from expanding to foreign markets, and will that create some conflict of interest between those domestic entities that are making the social media policies?
You're talking about Chinese tech companies expanding their activities in other countries?
Right.
It's a complicated situation. I think that perception of at least how these tech companies operate in China can adversely affect expansion to, shall we say, more established democracies. In fact, the Australian Parliament has, I think last week, banned their MPs from having WeChat installed on their phones, because the assumption is if you have WeChat or any of these other Chinese apps on your phone, they have your data, is the assumption that you have to make. There are differences, though, in how people are able to use these apps abroad versus in China. So, for example, the Citizen Lab out of the University of Toronto has done experiments where they have a user with a phone number in China and a user with a US phone number. Both have registered on WeChat, and they'll try to talk about, Taiwan independence or Hong Kong independence or the Tiananmen massacre, and the US user will be able to send or receive information with these kinds of related keywords, but the messages will be blocked and the Chinese user won't be able to receive them. And I do recommend looking at that study because they have the screenshots showing like, hey, did you get X? I did not get that text. I think that in terms of the spread of, or the popularity of these platforms just in the world in general, that WeChat has been fairly successful in Southeast Asia, and I think a little bit in Latin America. And there's definitely people, not just Chinese people, using it in those countries. It hasn't really picked up in the US. I think we already have our entrenched systems. And I think that, as I was mentioning earlier, that there's this flip side of the whole situation where companies that are based in the US, for example, will comply with this new cybersecurity law or with demands based on this principle of internet sovereignty in order to remain operable in China. And so, for instance, if you're on LinkedIn in China, it's not the same LinkedIn that everyone else is on. It's linkedin.cn. Facebook is blocked. Mark Zuckerberg has been, trying to cajole the Chinese government to let him back in. They do have an office in Beijing for selling ads, so they're not totally out of the picture there. And it doesn't apply as much to social media, but in terms of other apps or platforms or even hardware, there is now this legal pressure to comply with those laws. And actually, I was thinking about the question that Kathy asked earlier about how Taiwan can sort of fight back against this kind of disinformation. And I think this goes not just for Taiwan, but for the US and really every country, that the trouble with the internet is it's not just governed by governments, it's governed by these tech giants, and so they're making the rules. And if Apple decides that they're perfectly willing to hand information over to this government-affiliated data center, then that is what happens regardless of privacy and anti-surveillance regulations in the United States. For Taiwan's part, there's a hardware company, Asus, that actually decided to no longer offer data centers, or because of this regulation with the cybersecurity law and having to have the data centers in China, they actually decided about a month or so ago that, well, we're not going to open data centers in China. And if you're able to, scale the Great Firewall, get to your data as it's always been available overseas, great, but they chose not to comply. They, of course, then lose out on that market. But I think that there has to be it's not just a problem of how the government counteracts these issues. It's about how does the government liaise with a lot of them very large corporations, and make it so that they are more governed and that they can adhere to certain laws and principles in the countries where they are based.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, I'd like to pose one to Dr. King and really to the whole panel. It seems to me that everything we've been talking about for the last hour and a half is defensive in nature. How do we react? How do we combat? How do we overcome the things that the Chinese government is doing within China and now even in our country and in other democracies to subvert the free flow of information, to propagate negative images of the West and all the rest? Should we consider, or should we intensify our activities rather than in a defensive mode, in a more assertive mode? That is, to conduct a very serious information campaign in China and about China in the West. When you think back to the Cold War, we had Radio Free Europe and Voice of America which were constantly refuting and combating the propaganda and the hate information that was coming out of the Soviet Union. We have a similar situation today. That's the kind of thing we're hearing from China about the U.S., about the West. And do you think more needs to be done by VOA and by Radio Free Asia to be proactive within China and internationally?
I think we should work very hard to reveal what everything what they're doing. So we ought to put some effort, some considerable effort into research, into scaling up to be able to study everything that's going on. So if they are attacking us, like the Russians, I guess, we should know. We should know. Now, whether the U.S. government goes ahead and creates active opposition to do the same thing, that's a different question. But at a minimum, we should know everything that's happening. And that's within our capability. We can know what this giant propaganda operation is doing within their country and in our country. The capabilities of doing that exist. They don't exist yet in the U.S. government, but we could create them.
Should our government demand reciprocity? We allow China Daily and all kinds of Chinese media to function in the U.S. The Washington Post has a supplement every month, I think, which is the party line, and we welcome it here as an expression of opinion. But we don't have the same privilege there. You know, the New York Times or Washington Post can't put a supplement in the newspapers in Xinhua or elsewhere, giving the U.S. perspective. Should we be more demanding and more aggressive, I guess is a term we might use, to battle this it's a war of ideas? Should we be doing more on our side of it?
Well, Joe, I mean, I think, at the very least, yes, we should demand reciprocity. But I would also reinforce what Dr. King said. And that is, I think we have more capabilities to effect change that is already within our control. And that is really ensuring that the democratic institutions that are not undermined by these type of influence operation campaigns through the use of propaganda and disinformation. And I think there's a lot that we could be doing among democracies to be able to reinforce those types of norms and behaviors and legal frameworks that can better protect these institutions. I think demanding sort of change within China will have very limited effect. I think we should demand it, but nevertheless we should be mindful of the realistic expectation. We can do is a good first step.
Okay, I'll just close by saying that was the assumption, the working assumption throughout the Cold War in the Soviet. Eventually, truth did out. So I want to thank all of you for participating in this inclement weather, and thank our audience. Please join me. Our panelists.